Hi everyone, Steve here. Welcome to this edition of Monday Morning Musings. We have been going through the Old Testament Jewish scriptures trying to make the point that you cannot find Plato's doctrine of the soul anywhere in the Old Testament scriptures. Now we're about ready to move into the New Testament, and how we're going to approach this is we're going to take a very quick look and a very survey look at each gospel where the word in English soul appears. And then we're going to take a look at I would call Pauline psychology. We're not going to look at every epistle, and there are some slight variations between John and Peter and Paul, but in general, I'm just going to stick with Paul for the sake of these short devotional type videos. And before we get into that, we're going to do a little bit of review and just a little bit of introduction. So remember that the Platonic worldview, the Platonic view of the soul, was the very air, the cultural air of the world of Jesus and Paul. So that means uh, it doesn't mean you have to be talking about it all the time, but it was the consensus point of view. It was in the air, it was in the philosophical air. And so when we're done today, or done with this series, we're going to see how utterly incompatible Plato's view of the soul was with not only a Jewish point of view, which we've just been through, but with the way Paul handles the term, and as he often does, and as the New Testament authors often do, he changes a few terms, he adapts a few terms, he brings in new terms, brings in new definitions with old terms, and we'll get to that. So, but just a little bit of review first, where we've been with spending so much time on nefesh and the Hebrew word for soul. Just review, just review. There is no dualism in the Hebrew worldview between body and soul. Soul includes the entire being, and it even applies to animals, a living, moving being. The Hebrew word for body only occurs 14 times in the Old Testament, and it is never contrasted with the soul. Never. Now, 14 is not a lot in all those references. What does that tell you? That tells you that the Hebrew mindset of what constituted a human was more than just their mortal body, and that there's some sort of reality other than, or the material reality of our body is all that there is to being human. No, their word for soul, nefesh, included the totality. It was a synonym for an entire person. Now, we talked about ruach. Now, over time, that word came to mean to be associated with the breath of God. But it was really air in motion, and it was anything that animated a living soul. So Ruach expanded over time to include the whole range of emotional and volitional life that a human uh, could have, and the terms over time began to overlap. Nefesh and Ruach began to overlap. And it's a great example of how a word can change meaning over time. And that's why you can't just go to your concordance and say, well, here's what Strong said 125 years ago. Because you can't say, well, here's what the word means, period. What did it meant something to a certain people at a certain point in time, and often over time, those definitions and usages changed. We've talked about this before. It's called the etymological fallacy. You can't just make a big deal out of your Strong's Concordance word definitions. And I would strongly urge you to get a different concordance, because Strong's is old. It's over 100 years old. There's been new understandings, new developments in linguistics. Get rid of Strong's. Come in to the modern era. And don't make a big deal out of one definition. Because just like Nefesh and Ruach began to overlap, particularly in the intertestamental period, words can develop new meanings. You can't just say, here's what the word means, that's what it means it forever, it always meant that way. Every Jew, every place, for all time, believe you can't say that based on a Strong's definition. That's bad Bible study. So, in terms of review, short version, very, very short summary. Nefesh came to mean the totality of a human being in relationship to other, a living soul, a living being. And Ruach came to mean more than just the breath of God, but the totality of a human being in the relationship to God. So those terms in the intertestamental period began to merge. All right, and another nugget, another nuance that happened in the intertestamental period before we get to the Gospels, that a new distinction began to develop. And that is where the word pneuma that we see in the New Testament, which Paul uses a lot, appears, and it appears as a distinct entity different than or separate from psuche or psyche, the soul. So this is another significant development that the word, just like ruach moved from just being the general power or the breath of God in the earth to a constituent element of a human being. So the same things happen here with pneuma. The word pneuma gets introduced into the conversation. Now, Paul's use of psuche for the soul is much closer to the Old Testament understanding, the distinction, than the intertestamental period where they start to cross over. Here's why. Paul never uses, now, never is strong, he never uses psyche, as a separate entity, nor in a human, nor does he ever hint that the psuche, the soul, can exist outside of or apart from the body. Now, you need to get that. Never. And you would think in your average church that's basic gospel. Paul never taught that the psuche, the soul, could exist apart from or separate from the body. So these are just some of the intertestamental um, changes that happen that I want to share with you this morning regarding the whole concept of the soul before we even get into the Gospels. I'll see you the next time.